because of the toxic, infested junk food diet of the African man, the sperm is now deteriorated and crippled with waste, and it's very acid. Then you have conception, which produces a child, and the child is born with a birth defect or deformed. Now we have early abortions or partial abortions of children who are so, what they call, deformed or just shouldn't live as they decide. They just decide this already by taking these little x-ray pictures which cause cancer. All mammograms cause cancer, remember that. All x-rays cause cancer. All sonograms cause cancer. All Dopplers cause cancer. This is all in the Government Accounting Office publication. I wrote the number in my book, Nutricide, for those who want to order it. It's free, and they'll list all the medical procedures that cause cancer. In other words, cause tumors, fibroids that destroy the black woman's womb. So we have what we call partial abortions, where they can abort the child up to 7th, 8th, or 9th month. The issue is, if you want to murder a child in that stage of, in that trimester, you have to leave the head in the womb, and then you can call it abortion. So what they do is they leave the baby in, grab it by some forceps, which they call pliers. A layman would call them pliers. The medical people call their pliers forceps. So they grab the child with these forceps and yank the child out. Then the forceps were devised in European rituals and ceremonies because they thought the woman was evil, and the man didn't want to put his hand on her vagina. But we know that he did something to get the child there, but in this ritual, they don't want to touch the vagina. So they take these pliers, clamp the child, and pull the child out of the womb. Then they get the head right to the opening of the uterus, which some people call some people call the cervix. Then they push the scissors, push it into the back of the skull, puncture into the skull, then open up the scissors, which makes a hole. Then they stick a little hose inside of the skull, which is like a hose, like a tube, and it sucks the brain out. And then the skull collapses, and then they pull the baby out. This is called a partial abortion, or late-term abortion. And then they sell the parts, because they use fetus to make vaccination and inoculation shots, and they also use the organs, tissue for transplants, because African children's skin is the most flexible, and it can mate with other tissue more easily than any other race, so they sell a lot of these parts. So what we're trying to do is correct a condition here. Let me show you a healthy uterus. Let me show you how a healthy uterus looks. So we all know what I'm talking about. We're talking about the 3 layers in the uterus itself, serosus, which is the outer layer. Then we're talking about the muscular layer, which you call fiber, and some people say that's where the tumors are, and we call those fibroids because they're inside the fiber. Then we're talking about the endometrium, which is the inner layer of the uterus, which is right here. Sometimes that gets irritated by toxins and waste and gets inflamed, and that's when ladies say they have endometriosis, because the tissue gets inflamed. Now we have the vaginal wall, and of course this is the ovaries, and this is the fallopian tubes. This is a healthy uterus, and the 3 layers of tissue, skin, or germ layers. Now, everything is structured this way in nature, especially in the human form itself. You have these 3 layers. So when I'm talking about skin, I would call the serosus the ectoderm. And I would call the muscle layer the mesoderm. And I would call the inside layer the endoderm. I just changed the name so you won't know what I'm talking about. Now, if I'm talking about people, I would call the outside layer the ectomorphic people, which would be the Chinese and the Japanese. The mesomorphic people would be the Africans, and the endomorphic people would be the Europeans. Endomorphic means gut people. They have a lot of gut sounds, grunt sounds. They say, I have a gut reaction. They tell you what type of people they are. I have a gut reaction. I have a gut feeling. And sure enough, they refer to a lot of stomach. They name themselves out after a lot of stomach and eating terms, like Hun. H-U-N means without spirit or without food. So you get the word Hun, H-U-N, hunter, hungrier, hungry. and the tribe, the European tribe called the Huns. See, it's just when you get into understanding, they are endomorphic. They are basically driving on what you call animalism. They're predator people, and they prey on other people's cultures and all that kind of stuff. You should know that by now. If you're a former slave, you would know that. But nonetheless, we have these layers here. Understand that the reproductive system of the female functions basically the same as the male's. The vaginal shaft gets erect. The uterus contracts just like the prostrate contracts and pulsates. Same thing occurs here. Direct, same things. And when the vaginal shaft gets erect, the uterus tilts forward, slides down the shaft, and makes a cup that collects the sperm so it can go inside of the uterus. It's a process. The vaginal muscles, vagina muscles, start contracting and pulsating. And when they start contracting and pulsating, they start making colors. They start making notes, because anything that's pulsating is a frequency. It's an electromagnetic force. It creates a frequency, and frequencies can be measured, and you call those notes. You call it music. Like you tune pianos and all instruments based on the vibratory force of the pineal gland, 1440. You tune all instruments based on A, because that's the vibratory force of the pineal gland, 440. Everything is centered around this melanin issue here, and the pineal is where the melanin is made. So nonetheless, the vagina starts pulsating, making colors, and the penis shaft is in the vagina, and the pulsation goes up the shaft of the penis and starts pulsating back to the prostrate, which tunes the prostrate, puts the prostate on the same frequency of the uterus, which puts the sperm more in harmony with the egg. All this is like a dance, a symphonic dance. We get into the uterus, the fallopian tubes doing a dance, which they call the fertility dance, how the uterus moves around and about, and the Europeans call that a fertility dance, or distort that fertility dance and say it's a hoochie coochie, or the belly dance, which is called the fanning of the flame, the creating of the flame, which is life, from your solar center, where your umbilical cord is attached to your mother's solar center, attached to your solar center, and that's why all African things are based on the solar system. The metric system is a solar-based measurement. The calendar is a solar-based. Everything comes from the solar system. Metra means solar. You attach to the solar system of your mother. You're carried in the solar center of your mother. You follow me? So we get into this whole measurement and calculation based around solar cycles. But when you're into European culture, you're into lunar cycles, moon cycles. Oh, the moonlight's so pretty. Isn't it romantic? Everything is the moon, honeymoon. That's a lunar cycle. We're into a solar cycle. So we got to start getting on the right station to understand our reproductive system. Now that's a healthy uterus and fallopian tubes. Now this is one that has all types of fibroids in it. So you can see it. All types. I have all the types there. I have the pedunculated submucosal fibroid. That's the one that looks like a tree. This one looks like a tree. It has a stalk, it has branches, and it twists and it turns. And when it twists and turns, its roots start clamping harder on the muscles, and that's what causes the pain. When these fibroids start moving on their own, they get the nourishment, and when the blood comes through in the pulse, like that. Blood is pulsed through your body. You call it your pulse. That's how it's doing. It's going like that. And it starts pulsing in the tree of the fibroid, and the fibroid starts moving. And when it starts moving, it starts pain in the fiber of the uterus. And that's how you get this pains in the uterus from the pedunculated tumors. Remember, you had this waste. It irritates the fiber. Once the fiber gets irritated, it gets inflamed. Once it gets inflamed, it heats up. Once it heats up, it cooks the flesh. Once it cooks the flesh dies. Once it dies, it creates pus. The body says, I got this dead flesh, I got this pus, let me surround it so it won't contaminate the rest of me. And that's when you get the shell, that's when you get the fibroid, the cyst encased in there. Tissue grows around it to protect it. Now, when it grows around it to protect it, it also traps veins in there. Now the veins can't get a clear flow of blood in and out, so the veins start ballooning, and so they burst. And that's what we call chocolate. When we used to open them up in the operating room, that you cut them open and it just be brown blood coming out. We call it chocolate then. when I used to do that sort of thing. I was in traditional medicine. Then we have subserous fibroid with fibers into the myometrium. These are the fibers itself. It grows like a tree, and the fibers grow into the fibers of the uterus and the mesoderm. It grows right in there and starts strangling the blood supply to various section of the uterus, and that section dies. So what we're trying to do is understand that this condition can be corrected by correcting the diet, going back to eating foods in their natural state to keep you in your natural state, going back to using real medicine, herbs, not that synthetic dirt which the Europeans peddle as medicine, the Tylenol, which decreases the blood supply to the pelvic girdle and to the uterus. Aspirin does the same thing. Sedatives cause cysts and tumors. All those neuroleptics cause nerve damage, which stops the correct response between the brain and the body. Neuroleptics, tranquilizers, sedatives. You've heard of them before, Prozac, things of that sort we use today. But nonetheless, we have the firm, hard, calcified fibroid. That's there. And so it's not able to maintain temperature. So it's colder than the rest of the temperature, the rest of the uterus. Now, because it's colder, the uterus doesn't have the right temperature in that area to get the proper blood flow, because the coldness slows down the blood in that area. And that causes tissue to die. So what we're going to do is increase the blood supply to the uterus. Increase it with nourishment, with healthy things. Let me just go over one more example here. I just don't want you to lose track of what I'm talking here. I'm talking about the uterus and the vagina. I was talking about the area here, the muscles that contract and vibrate. Move us up something for you. The muscles that contract here and vibrate. Sometimes the bacteria, fungus, and yeast that live in the uterus and live in the eyes and live all over the body, because you can't function without bacteria and yeast, as you call it, and fungus. This population gets out of control. Sometimes if you feed it too much dead things like white sugar, bleached white flour, then what grows on dead things? Mushrooms, fungus. So the fungus starts growing on this dead stuff. And that fungus-like infection is called a yeast infection. So now you have to get off of all the white sugar, all the bleached white flour, because remember, they were on food anyway. They're processed bowel movements, synthetics. So you have to come off all that synthetic food because you're going to feed the yeast infection. Now you come off the white sugar, the bleached white flour, and walking around and say, what can I eat? I don't have nothing to eat. You can't eat any fermented food, acidic acid, vinegar, any alcohol, any wine, or any beer. They're not food anyway. So now you're stuck with eating food and walk around and say, what can I eat? You can eat food, because those things I talked about are synthetics. We have these broad ligaments here. We have the uterus here. Understand that orgasm is not just a sensation derived from the stimulation of the labia minora, labia majora, and clitoris. Orgasm in women occur with the rocking motion of the uterus and of these ligaments, of the pelvic girdle itself. It gets into a rocking motion. And this rocking motion stimulates what we call an orgasm. But the Europeans cut all that out and give you what is called a hysterectomy. It's a money-making thing here. Now I'm going to move on and go to some of the things that are used to treat various conditions of the uterus. The endometriosis, as I mentioned, is treated with burdock and saw palmetto, which is good for the fallopian tubes, by the way, and feverfew, which is used to reduce the temperature. So I'm dropping the temperature of the uterus, which is where you get this endometriosis and itis. All itis means inflammation, tonsillitis, appendicitis, all that means inflammation. So I'm dropping the temperature of the uterus so the nutrients can get in. The white willow is primarily used for pain. That's under endometriosis where I'm at. I'm down to white willow. Comfrey is a herb that has what they call allotone in it, which is good for healing. So I'm using comfrey. I'm using ginseng. They like Siberian ginseng, but all ginseng basically will do just the same, is stabilizing the energy level. And there you have mullein under ginseng, which is good for mucosal membrane, mucous membrane tissue. Helps keep it nourished. Remember, the things that attack the mucous membrane attaches to mucosal tissue all over. That's why antihistamines, cough suppressants, all stop the correct flow of nutrients in and out of the uterus, because it stops and suppresses fluids in the uterus. It says it's a cough suppressant. It suppresses mucus flow in the uterus. Now the uterus can't secrete waste out because you suppress it with a cough suppressant, an anti-deodorant, whatever you call those things. All those things stop the fluid all over the body, brain, eyes, everywhere. So the person has to come off of those kind of things, the synthetic deodorant, the antiperspirants, the deodorized soap, all these things that keep waste in when your body's trying to throw waste out. That's why we're using the mullein, because that works on the mucosal membrane tissue and helps it to get back its vitality to nourish the system. And primrose primarily is used for what people call the PMS and pain, but actually it stimulates the pineal gland. It's good for the pineal gland, which has to be in the process or the treatment wouldn't hold. If you don't use primrose, then use any herb such as ginkgo or gotu-kola or rosemary or St. John's wort that helps increase the blood supply to the pineal gland and cause the treatment regimen that you're taking to hold. Then we have dung quoit, which is in the angelica family, and red raspberry leaves, which is all-around herb used for women's disorders. It's also good for the prostrate. It's also good for children. It's also good for colds in children. These herbs are not just limited to what I'm saying. They cover a broad spectrum. But red raspberry leaves are used primarily as the all-in-all herb for the female system. It helps lessen the pain of birth. It helps strengthen the uterus. It helps with the milk. Then we get into the supplement, allantoin, which I told you is derived from comfrey, and currans, which has the what you call gamma-linolenic acid in it. Currans, which is a type of a raisin. And all grapes, especially red grapes, are good for stimulating the pineal gland. And the bioflavonoids, which are used to help stabilize the tissue. Some people use that for hemorrhoids or varicose veins. Lecithin is good for varicose veins too. So is chromium picolinate, by the way. Then we're back to evening primrose capsules and the folic acid, which is good for stimulating the hair, the follicles. And remember, the follicles is nothing more than melanin. So it's good in stimulating the melanin, the follicle. Folic acid, and B6, which helps transmit the nervous messages, because the nervous message between the brain and the reproductive system, irritants and synthetic foods. So now we got to stabilize the nerves. Vitamin B6 is also good for what people call today carpal tunnel syndrome. Calcium and magnesium. That's good for stabilizing the nervous system, stabilizing the protein in the body. Because African people don't require as much protein as Europeans, and we stabilize our protein with vitamin D, vitamin K, calciums, and magnesiums, because calciums come in a complex. Like you have a B complex, you have about 8 different types of calciums. But you can't get all of those in supplements. You can only get those when you eat properly. You get the right calciums. But we're just isolating one calcium and one magnesium here. And zinc, which is good for all infections, colds, flus. It's good for anorexia nervosa, people who just stop eating, who lose their appetite. You can regenerate the appetite by using zinc. And we have kelp, which is used for electrolytes, which is minerals that carry electricity. We call those electrolytes. And they sell a cheap form of electrolytes today. We call it a sodium chloride. They put that in Gatorade and say, you got electrolytes. And then phenylalanine, which is good for suppressing the appetite, is also good for depression. It's also used with hyperactive children as well. And melatonin, which today is used to help stimulate and enhance the melatonin in your body, and it's used for sleeping. And liquid melatonin is sometimes used with hyperactive children. You have to give them a little bit in the morning, a little bit in the evening to keep them off the Ritalin. And organic iron. The problem with taking synthetic iron is that it's constipated. It's constipating and it constipates. It is in a form that the body cannot use. The minerals have to be wrapped inside of a live tissue of a plant. All minerals are inorganic and the body cannot digest them. So the body can only use the minerals when they're in a colloidal form, as the Europeans call it today, when they're wrapped around a plant or inside of a plant, chelated as they say sometimes, meaning that chelate means claw, meaning that it's a plant wrapped around it, the inorganic mineral, which we call enzymes. Enzymes are hormones, hormones are vitamins. They're all the same. It's just when the activity goes this way, we call it enzyme. When the activity goes that way, we call it a hormone. When it goes this way, we call it a vitamin. So a lot of times you get confused in all of these things. But on the science side, the people in the science know. But they just tell the public anything, and y'all go for these things. It's just a change in the behavior that gives us a change in name. Vitamin, hormone, enzyme. Just like if you change your behavior, they call you a thief, they call you an honest person, they call you a nice person. You're the same person, but if you change your behavior, they change your title. It's the same with the nutrients. So don't get all lost with it. Then we have the herbs that are used for premenstrual syndrome. You see the ones for uterine bleeding. We have to stop the bleeding. Usually I use vitamin K straight away. I have to stop the bleeding first before I do anything. And that requires at least 10 of those vitamin K tablets, sometimes 10 a day, sometimes 10 3 times a day. The objective is to stop the bleeding. I rely a lot on vitamin K and comfrey for that. Comfrey is the herb with the allotonin in it, as I mentioned before, that's used to stop the bleeding. And then you can see the herbs that are used for premenstrual syndrome and menstruation to increase it or decrease it. Some ladies like to bring on cellular hemorrhaging because they were taught that menstruation is necessary. Menstruation is a loss between 3 and 5 tablespoons of blood, between 4 and 6 tablespoons of blood in Europeans. And menstruation consists of those 4 to 6 tablespoons of blood, some cellular debris, and some mucus. It's all mixed together, and it's not all blood. Usually bright red blood is an indication of carbohydrates. Dark red blood is usually indicating fats and protein. Blood with a smell is usually protein. So you can tell by the color of the blood what is going on in the system, whether it's from the pancreas and spleen, or whether it's from the liver, or which organs are involved in this disease process. If it's clotting, then you know that it's being held in the system. It's not coming out in clumps, it's just clots. It stays in one spot and then it comes out. But a lot of times ladies think they pass in clots, but it's clots in one spot, then it passes out. There's just a lot of misconceptions about the reproductive system because it's exploited and people make a lot of money off of it. Hysterectomies, PMS, aspirin, Tylenol, Midol. It's a lot of money to be made off the system. Tampons cause tumors and cysts. And I have the remedies that are commonly used for these illnesses. There's a yeast-like fungus. It's called Candidus albicans. Let me move this over some so you can see it. Those are standard herbs used for that. Portiaco is the main one that's used today for that. It will get rid of the Candidus yeast infection, as it's called, which is actually a fungus infection. Fungus is an indication, of course, of using antibiotics or using a lot of processed carbohydrates. So that's white sugar, bleached white flour. Fungus is also an indication of being hypersex, so just focusing on a lot of sex. That's why you find a lot of fungus infections in men, like athlete's foot or jock itch or jock rot, as they call it. A fungus infection. Now I'm going to move down to the one that involves tumors, since that's the one that's the crisis in the black community with African women. Fibroid tumors. As I mentioned before, it's not the size, it's the location that presents the problem of the fibroids. I usually use a combination of these herbs here: sheep sorrel, burdock, dandelion, red clover, saw palmetto, echinacea, golden seal, chickweed, and I use St. John's wort for the depression that diseases cause. People get very burnt out from concentrating on the disease process. It's very draining to concentrate on the disease. It's very draining to even talk about it. You're just simply talking about your illness can just give birth to those emotions and feelings, and those emotions and feelings can burn you out, drain you of energy. So I use the St. John's wort just to nourish the nervous system. And I use these herbs, actually all of them in combination, not just one, all of them. That's when I'm being very aggressive with the treatment. All of them are used in equal parts, and I add usually a female herb of some sort with that formula to increase the blood supply to the pelvic girdle. That would be a red raspberry or chaste tree berries. I lean more toward chaste tree berries because it's a berry from an African tree, the chaste tree. But I usually use a female herb in combination with all the herbs here to help focus the blood supply to the pelvic girdle. And these supplements are used, zinc in particular, because it has a healing quality, and lecithin, and garlic, and coenzyme Q10, vitamin A, which is good for infections, ear infections, and all types of infections, along with zinc. And I use also lysine, which is amino acid that's used for infections and herpes and all sorts of kind of diseases of that sort. But the main purpose is to reestablish the healthy environment for the tissue. And that requires changing the diet. I'll show you the herbs that are used for menopause: blessed thistle, false unicorn, squabine. Squaw is the European word for pussy, and they call African women by this name. It's a very degrading name to call African woman. African native, which we call the Cahutis and the Jamases. These are Africans that came over before Columbus, who taught the Native Americans all this dressing and music in the high-rise apartment buildings and the pyramids. These are Africans that came over. So I was saying Africans to be historically correct, but we associate them as Native Americans. They're called Tar Heels, Brass Ankles, Blackfoots. Those are Africans who lived here in America before Columbus, long before the Native Americans, who you call Indians, and taught them a lot of things. The dancing, the drum rhythms, and all these things that we associate with Native Americans are actually African. Just like you associate the Moors who brought this music into Spain that you call Latin. That's African music. The Moors brought it in. But a lot of our things are just taken away from us. Now I'm going back to claim them so we know what we're about and have more strength. So this is a negative term, the squabine, for Native American women. But we still use it because the Europeans control the herb market. Merck controls the vitamin C market. The Japanese control the amino acid market. Squabine, the dunquois, the black cohosh, the red raspberry, and the chaste tree berries is used for menopause. And all those herbs, same herbs I mentioned before, used for hot flashes. But once we reconstitute the system and get it back on a healthy level, then we don't have to worry about this anymore. We get away from eating the synthetic foods, the processed foods, the waste. Because this waste gets in the muscles lose their flexibility, and then we get into a condition known as a prolapsed uterus. That's when the uterus no longer has enough strength in the muscles that suspend it, hold it in place. We have two in the front that attach to the pubic symphysis bone, two that attach in the back to your spinal column, as you call it, the vertebrae, and we have the two on the side that keep the uterus in position, because the uterus has an orbit, it moves about. But when these muscles get full of waste, they can't move like they should, and the uterus starts slipping down. This was a condition during slavery, just as ulcers and stress-related diseases occurred during slavery as well, which we think all of these things are rather new. Eventually, the uterus falls right out of the vagina because of the waste, due to the diet or the waste that is injected to it by the acid waste in the man's sperm from eating junk food, alcohol, acetic acid, and all sorts of things that are not food. Sometimes you get in-between bleeding, mid-period bleeding. Sometimes it's due to ovarian cysts. This is normal to have that cyst. That's the blood that's lost when the egg comes out of the ovary. That's a little bit of blood. Then you have some blood that's lost when the egg is not fertilized, which is about 3 drops of blood at the most. That is called classical menstruation. That is menstruation. 3 drops of blood. That's menstruation, but that's classical menstruation. We have modern menstruation, which is a combination of hemorrhaging. That's when the endometrial tissue inside the uterus itself loses stability and begins to deteriorate and burst and bleed. And that's what people call menstruation, but that is hemorrhaging. There's a difference between classical menstruation and hemorrhaging, but we lump them all together. But that is not so. Once the diet is changed, then the menstruation or bleeding part of the cycle decreases. Menstruating, as you call it, between 5 and 7 days is heading toward a cyst or tumor, guaranteed. Especially when they're 12 and 13 and 14 with a period that long, they're heading toward cysts and tumors. If the lady has this cramps and all these signs and symptoms going on that I showed you earlier, where the pain is referring in the pelvic girdle, referring up to the muscles in the neck, which are related to the lower system, the reproductive system. You get pain in the other areas of the body related to the reproductive system. Getting all this referred pain at 13 and 14 and 15, that's the signs and symptoms of a cyst or tumor on its way. The diet alone can indicate that. Red meat especially, dairy products, alcohol. On that kind of diet, eating junk food, hitting into a fibroid tumor or cyst. That's why close to 70% of African women have fibroids. It's not a diet for us. We're eating out of our nature into someone else's nature, and we pay the cost of it. That's why 50% of the African men have prostate disease. You've heard of them, Sidney Poitier, Minister Farrakhan, Barry, and it goes on and on, Mayor Barry of Washington, D.C. It's an endless list. And you wonder what's going on. It's because we're eating out of our nature. We have to go back to eating in nature, with nature, natural foods, raw foods, steamed fruits, vegetables. And then we won't have these kind of illnesses going on. I just want to show you a picture of the herbs and how they look. Excuse me. This is how medicine looks. Looks pretty. Looks pretty enough to eat. All these are herbs used to treat the reproductive system of the female, of women. We have birchroot, we have blue cohosh, we have witch hazel, shepherd purse. I use that a lot for bleeding, hemorrhaging, too much bleeding. I use shepherd's purse. And then we have licorice, which is used as an estrogen stimulator. Then we have down at the bottom here, black cohosh. They look pretty. And these are the natural medicine. These are the medicines we want to get back to in order to restore the uterus so we won't get into these fibroid kind of conditions, these adhesions, where the tissue loses its constitution and starts by the laws. And we go right down to these bones, as I mentioned before. This is where the red blood cells are made inside, hemopoiesis as they call it. The red blood cells are made inside of these bones. And as you can see, they have these melanin centers, which are circular all around them. And this fires off and energizes the system and controls the way the bones are made and the bone's constitution. And that is the same for the heart. The heart itself has these 4 chambers. The blood comes in and is mixed with air, and it goes out to the lungs, and it gets rid of carbon monoxide, picks up oxygen, comes back to the heart, and is part of the circulatory system. But this is a muscle. And since it is a muscle, it is melanated. And it's melanated, it has rhythm. And it has rhythm, it's dependent upon the nutrition of the pineal gland for its ability to function. So to deprive the pineal gland of its nutrients is to deprive your heart, your bone structure, the muscles, the hair, the brain, the pineal gland, the hypothalamus, the cerebrospinal fluid, which is brain fluid that goes up and down your back and helps regenerate your system. It also deprives your lungs, which also use villi, as we call it, hair, as I mentioned before. It is all inside of your body, which gives you a stomach about the area of a football field if you lay it out because of the villi. Highly absorbent. Now that we have somewhat of a understanding of the melanin and how it's distributed in the body, we'll get more into the
the venereal diseases and how they violate the laws. Yes, the venereal diseases violate the law because we're not following the rhythm of the body. And the rhythm of the body is directly related to the rhythm of the sun and the moon and the planets. So we have to have an understanding how these work together and how they're reinforced. We reinforce the rhythmicity of the body, the brain, the reproductive system with colors. We reinforce it with music. We reinforce it with movements. And those are all what the Indian people, Ayurvedic people, and the Chinese people call qi, and the Ayurvedic people call chakras. Those all come out of Africa. The whole system of acupuncture comes out of Kemetits. That's around 2300 BC, and we taught that to the Chinese. So we need not focus on the Hindu, the Indian, and the Chinese structure. Those are good for Chinese people, just as the European structure is good for European people. We have to focus more on the Afrocentric, the African structure of our bodies. To follow the Chinese structure, they do not stimulate as many melanin centers in their brain because they don't have as many as African people. We have 12, the Europeans have 2, Japanese have 7, the Chinese have 8. They do not have as many centers as we do, so we really cannot use their charts. They make us ill. They help lower out the intensity of our pineal gland. But nonetheless, that's what we have available until we Afrocentricize their form of medicine to suit our internal needs. So we're going to look at their charts, and I'll explain the other chakras or chi or energy force fields which we have in the brain and our colon and our reproductive system as we go along. We'll start down at the bottom here. The bottom level, we have a right side and a left side, which is traditionally called the female attribute and the male attribute. Although the Europeans call the right side the male side because they believe the man is right and the woman is left or inferior. So they give these names, inferiorized names, based on their religious system or their superstitious system. So we come down to what they call the number 1 chakra. This is coming out of another culture. They call this system, the sexual system in European culture, the main center. And they call the sex gland the main gland, the pituitary. They call this number 1. They start from the bottom and go up. Just as they start in music, they start from the low note and go up to the high note. Well, in African music and the African system of logic, we start with the pineal gland. So this is number 1. Then the pituitary gland is number 2, and we go down this way because we know the pineal gland is the basis for our life itself. It controls the rhythm, puts us in order with the planets and in harmony with ourselves. Now, the pituitary gland and the pineal gland are located in the brain, that is true, but their locus of focus is different. The locus of focus, or the center where the pineal gland is at the third ventricle, is attached to the roof of it, which is the trinity or triune self, as some call it. I will give you an idea of how this flows. We go from, instance, we have the musical note D, which is related to gold, which is related to the frankincense, which is a herb, and we have the musical note G, which is for infections, and that's silver, and the fragrance would be jasmine and calamus. We have the musical note C, which is related to your blood, and the metal would be iron, and the fragrance would be pine. We have the musical note E, which is for your digestive system and organs. It's related to the metal lead and the fragrance lavender. We have the musical note B, which is related to the nerves, and the metal is tin, and the fragrance is oak and cedar. We have the musical note F, which is related to the circulatory system and heart, and the metal is mercury, and the fragrance is rose, as well as sandalwood. And we have the musical note A, which is related to the ENT, your ear, nose, and throat, and your emotions, and the metal is copper, and the fragrance is myrrh. Now, all of this is based on the circadian rhythm, which is a 24-hour clock. And at 1 o'clock, we have the principal organ of the liver, which fires off. The liver is in this section of your body, and that's at 1 o'clock. Each organ has a primary time when it is optimum, when it's producing energy. The liver is at 1 a.m., the lungs at 3 a.m., the liver, the large intestines at 5 a.m., the stomach is at 7 a.m., the spleen is at 9 a.m., the heart is at 11 a.m., The small intestines at 1 p.m., the bladder's at 3 p.m., the kidneys at 5 p.m., your regulator, which is your pineal gland, is at 7 p.m., and again your energy, which is your another regulator pineal gland function, is at 9 p.m., and your gallbladder is at 11 p.m. These are the firing sequences of the internal organs which let you know when something is going on wrong in your system. Now, we're going from these higher colors, which this is the melanin breakdown of colors. We go from indigo to blue to all of these colors which are produced by the pineal gland, and they flow this way in a rainbow form. All the laws of order has to follow the pineal gland sequence of colors. That's where you get rainbows from, and how they break off in certain angles. At a 42-degree angle, we have a rainbow forming when it strikes the clouds. And this is the angle in which that same angles in which the ventricle is in your brain. It follows that same law. Now, bodies are structured inherently with these laws. So up in here, which is the number 1 gland, we have the pineal gland. And then we have the hair and central nervous system. Then we get down to the pituitary gland, you see. This is the glandular network. And then we go to the thyroid gland, the thymus, which becomes very inactive with Europeans. Lysine and another amino acid called arginine stimulates the thymus gland, by the way, and gets it to be active. And we're going down the glandular network, but then we go down to the liver, and we go down to the other gland, the spleen, and then we go to the other glands, the ovaries, and we go down to the other glands, the testicles. So we have a glandular network that runs down the body. You stimulate the pineal gland, and all these glands follow in a domino shape in us, a domino sequence, and are stimulated. Then we go down to the harmonious effect of the organ system itself. Certain organs are believed to possess certain energy force fields. The pineal gland is a harmonizer, a balancer, so we have harmony related to the pineal gland. We have the pituitary gland, which is related to generative principles, as they call it, reproduction. So we have that kind of characteristics associated with this gland. Then we also have the thyroid gland, which is dealing with the feelings and your creativity and speaking. All these glands have an emotional component to them, as well as a mentalistic component to it, as well as a spiritual component to it. And they go down the body in a sequence of stimulation. So they all follow in this rhythm, and when you violate this rhythm, certain things happen to your body. And that's what we're going to get into. Yes, these rhythms are actually taught to us as we are children in an Afrocentric kind of setting. They have things what the Europeans call toys, and these were known as spiritual